The eyes did not blink. They hung in the mouth of the cave, green and slitted and patient. Two cold lamps floating in a darkness that had swallowed the rain and the stars and every honest sound the jungle had ever made. Arthur did not move. He had stopped breathing somewhere in the last few seconds without deciding to, and now his lungs sat in his chest like wet stones, aching, refusing to fill. Alpha Predator, Jungle Stalker, threat level extreme, survival probability 0.8%. The numbers floated in the corner of his vision, calm and blue and obscene. 0.8%. He had failed enough tests in his old life to know what a number like that meant. It meant the test had already decided to fail him. "Do not move," System said. Its voice arrived inside his skull rather than his ears, level, surgical, the way a scalpel is level before it opens you. If it has not confirmed your position, any sound will do that for it. Hold. Arthur held. The smell reached him before the rest of it did. Musk and old blood and something sweeter underneath. Rot folded into rot, the breath of a thing that ate and never once cleaned its teeth. It rolled into the small space and coated the back of his throat, and his stomach, empty for 3 days, turned over and tried to climb his ribs. The stalker came forward. It did not rush. It poured. The body that followed the eyes was longer than 2 men laid end to end, and lower than Arthur had let himself imagine. A slung weight of muscle moving on padded feet that made no noise against the stone. The cave that had felt like shelter 10 heartbeats ago shrank into a coffin around him. Cold mud at his back, cold stone above, and the green eyes lowering as the great flat head dipped beneath the lip of the entrance and found him. It saw him. He felt the moment it happened the way you feel a held breath break. The eyes fixed, the pupils widened, drinking him in. A sound began somewhere deep in the chest of the thing, not a roar, worse than a roar, a low engine of intent that he felt in the marrow of his teeth and the cracked seam of his ribs. "Now you may panic," System said. "Crevice, hard right, ground level. I will count. On 3, you go low and you go fast. 1. "It's too far," Arthur breathed. 2. "I can't outrun that." "You will not run. You will go where it cannot." 3. The stalker lunged. Arthur threw himself flat and right, and the world became a single white instant of noise. The lunge that should have ended him met the place his head had occupied a quarter second earlier, and claws the length of his fingers raped the stone with a shriek that lit the dark in sparks. Grit and rock dust burst across his face. He kept moving, scrabbling on his belly through the cold, wet muck, ribs screaming with each drag of his weight, and the wolf fang skittered out of his hand and was gone into the black. He did not stop for it. Stopping was death. The crevice was a vertical wound in the rock, a slit barely wider than his shoulders, half hidden behind a fold of stone. System's marker pulsed inside it, a small, steady blue heartbeat. Arthur reached it the way a drowning man reaches a rope, with no grace and all his life, and he jammed himself into the gap. His shoulders went through, his chest did not. The cracked rib caught against the rock like a hook set in his side. The pain was not pain. It was a white sheet thrown over the whole world, blinding, total, and for one horrible suspended moment he was wedged half in and half out of the only thing keeping him alive. "Exhale," System said. "All of it. Empty your lungs and your chest will narrow by 11 millimeters. That is your margin. Exhale, Arthur, now. He did not understand the number, and he did not need to. He emptied himself in one ragged push, and his ribs contracted around the agony, and the rock let him through. He fell into the dark on the far side, as the stalker hit the crevice behind him. The whole rock face shuddered. A paw the size of his chest punched into the gap, claws hooking, raking the air a hand's width from his bare and bloodied feet. He pulled his legs to his chest and pressed himself back against the inner wall. The great limb withdrew and struck again and again, the claws screaming against stone, the eyes burning green in the slot of light, the engine sound rising into something that finally became a roar. The roar filled the crevice, the passage, the inside of Arthur's head, and he understood, distantly, beneath the ringing, that he was making a sound himself, a thin, high animal whine he could not stop. Then the paw withdrew and did not return. The green eyes hung in the slot a moment longer, watching, calculating, in whatever way a thing like that calculated. Then they were gone, and there was only the wet dark, the drumming of his own pulse, the smell of copper where the stone had opened the skin across his shoulders. "It cannot follow," System said. "Its shoulder span exceeds the aperture by a factor that does not interest you right now. You are, for the moment, alive." Arthur lay against the cold stone and shook. He shook for a long time. Not from cold, though he was cold, and not from fear, though the fear was still in him like swallowed glass. He shook because his body had been asked for everything it had, and had given it, and now it was sending him the bill. His feet were a single throbbing ruin. His ribs grated when he breathed. His shoulders wept where the rock had peeled them. And somewhere very far away, in a life he was not sure had ever truly belonged to him, a man named Arthur Chen had once worried about deadlines and traffic and whether the coffee was burnt. "You are not finished," System said. "The passage descends. There is air moving through it, which means it does not end here. We will use the time the Stalker has given us. Can you crawl?" It was not really a question. "I can crawl," Arthur said. His voice came out cracked. "I can do anything that isn't dying." The passage was the throat of the earth, and it tried to swallow him whole. It dropped at angles that forced him onto his belly, sliding, gripping with torn fingertips in the sides of his ruined feet, the stone slick with a film of moisture that smelled of minerals and deep cold water. In places the phosphorescent moss glowed on the walls, a sick faint blue that showed him the next arm's length and nothing more. In other places there was no light at all, only the black, and he felt his way forward, inch by blind inch, with his heart in his mouth, and System counting the air currents he could not feel. "Left. The floor falls away on your right. Do not put weight there." He obeyed. He had learned in a single brutal hour that System's instructions were not opinions. They were the difference between the next breath and no more breaths at all. Time came apart in the dark. He measured it in the things his body did. The number of times his ribs caught and made him stop and press his forehead to the stone and wait for the white sheet to lift. The slow return of feeling to his frozen toes, which was worse than the numbness because feeling meant fire. "You are doing well," System said, when he had stopped believing he was doing anything at all. "The descent is nearly complete. The air ahead is warmer and the humidity is rising. We are approaching open space." The passage opened without warning. One moment he was wedged in stone, and the next the walls fell away from his hands, and he was tumbling, rolling down a short slope of damp grit, and he came to rest on his back on a flat floor in a chamber larger than the cave above, a bubble blown into the deep rock. The blue moss grew thick here, enough to see by, painting everything in the colour of drowned things. Far overhead, a narrow chimney rose toward a smudge of grey, and the air that fell down it was wet and warm, and carried faintly the green breathing smell of the jungle. Living air. Air that had not been inside the stalker's lungs. Arthur did not get up. He could not. He lay on the cold stone and let his chest heave and his body remember how to be a body. Damage report, System said, and began the inventory whether he wanted it or not. 2 ribs fractured, 1 displaced, multiple lacerations, shoulders and back. Both feet infected. The infection in the left foot has reached the lymphatic system. Untreated, you have perhaps 4 days before it kills you more reliably than any predator. That's a comfort, Arthur said to the ceiling. It was not intended as one. It was intended as a list of problems with solutions. Turn your head to the right. The lower wall. The pale growths. A bracket fungus, System said. The compounds in the flesh are antibacterial. Not a cure, a delay. A few days bought against the infection. You will crush it. You will make a paste. And you will pack it into the wounds on your feet. It will hurt. Everything hurts. Then you will not notice the difference. Move. He moved. He dragged himself to the wall and tore the cold, soft shelves of fungus from the rock and crushed them between 2 stones into a grey-green pulp that smelled of earth and bitterness, and he packed it into the split and weeping skin of his feet. System was right. It hurt. A deep, cold burn that brought tears to his eyes and a curse to his lips in a language no one in this world had ever heard. But beneath the burn, almost at once, came something else. A drawing, a cooling. The fire of the infection pulling back, just slightly, just enough. Better, System said. You will not die in your sleep tonight. Now sit up, we are not done. I can barely move. You can sit. Sit. The stalker will tire of the upper entrance eventually, and it will scent that you have gone deeper. This chamber has a second exit. Before you use it, you are going to make something. Make what? A tool, System said. Your first. Up there with the tribe, weakness was a thing other men decided about you. Down here, it is only a fact about your arms. We are going to make it irrelevant. The stone was everywhere, and Arthur had never once truly looked at it. Now, with System's markers pulsing across his vision, he saw the chamber differently. He saw a chunk of dull grey that System named chert, fine-grained, eager to fracture. He saw a black, glassy nodule half buried in the grit that System named obsidian. Hold the chert in your offhand, System said. Brace it on your thigh. You will strike the edge, not the face. The angle matters more than the force, which is the only reason a man with your arms can do this at all. A point on the stone lit blue. Strike here, down and slightly inward. One sharp blow. He struck. Nothing. A dull clack and a chip of grit and a fresh split across his already torn fingertips. He swore and shook his hand and struck again and again, and the chert sat there mocking him, refusing to be anything but a rock. The failure built in his chest the way it always had. The old familiar voice of the tribe telling him what he was. Useless, worthless, a consumer of what stronger men bled to provide. "Stop," System said. "You are striking like a man trying to break the stone. You are not breaking it. You are persuading it. Watch the grain. There, the ripple in the surface. Strike just behind the ridge, into the meat of it, and let the stone do what stone wants to do." Arthur breathed. His ribs ground. He looked at the rock the way System told him to look at it, not as an enemy, but as a problem with a shape. And the shape resolved, and he saw the ridge and the meat behind it. He set the angle. He struck. The chert opened along a clean, curved fracture and dropped a flake into his palm, thin and broad and edged like a wound. He held it up to the blue light and turned it, and the edge caught the moss glow and threw it back, and it was sharper than the wolf fang he had lost in the dark above, sharper than anything the tribe had ever let him touch. He had made it. Not found it, not been given it, made it, out of a rock and an angle and a thing in his head that refused to let him quit. "That," said Arthur quietly, "is a knife." "That is a flake," System corrected. "Crude, asymmetric, and good enough. You will make 4 more, because tools break, and a man with one tool is a man with none." He struck again, the chamber filled with the small sharp sound of it. Clack and clack and clack, stone persuading stone, while the blood dried on his fingers and the infection bargained quietly with the fungus in his feet. By the time he had 5 flakes laid out on the flat rock before him, none beautiful, all sharp, his hands had stopped shaking. Not from strength. He had no strength. From something older than strength. Something the chieftain's cold, pale eyes had never seen in him because they had never bothered to look. He gathered the flakes into a fold of his ragged tunic. He pushed himself to his feet, and his feet held, packed with bitter paste and bound in cloth. And they held. "The second exit rises to the south," System said, "half a kilometer. It opens above the jungle floor on a ledge. From there we find water and a place to make fire, and we begin the long business of keeping you alive past the end of this week. Climb." The second passage was kinder than the first, or perhaps Arthur was simply harder now. He climbed through the wet dark with 5 stone blades against his chest and a body that had been broken and had decided, for reasons it had not consulted him about, to keep going anyway. The air warmed. The smell of green grew stronger, and then the moss gave way to a paler light, and he pulled himself up over a lip of stone and out onto a ledge, and the jungle opened below him in the last grey before dawn. It was beautiful, and it wanted him dead, and he had never been so glad to see anything in his life. Mist hung in the canopy. Water sang somewhere below, over stone. The humidity settled onto his skin like a wet hand, and he stood on the ledge and breathed it and felt, for one unguarded moment, something dangerously close to hope. "Arthur," System said. The tone had changed. He had heard it change exactly once before, in the cave, in the instant before the green eyes appeared. "What?" he said. "Look southeast, above the tree line. Tell me what you see." He looked. For a moment there was only the grey jungle and the rising mist. And then he saw them, low on the horizon, faint but unmistakable against the dark, points of orange light, flickering, spaced apart in a wide and deliberate line. Not one fire, not two. Count them, System said, very quietly. 6, Arthur whispered. His mouth had gone dry. 6 fires. 6 hunting parties, System said, spread in a sweep formation, moving north toward this ridge. The tribe did not trust the cat to finish you. The chieftain has sent men to make certain. A pause, a fraction of a second, the space between one heartbeat and the next. They are tracking the only thing that came down off this mountain alive. They are tracking you, and at their current rate of advance, the nearest party will reach the base of your ledge in 9 minutes. The orange lights moved. The mist swallowed them and gave them back. Arthur stood on the ledge with 5 stone flakes against his chest and his ruined feet bleeding through their bindings. And from the jungle directly below him, close, far too close, much nearer than 9 minutes, a single voice called out into the dark. A man's voice, calling his name.